For blood test number 2 in 2025, when using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age calculator, PhenoAge, we saw that my biological age was 22 years younger than the chronological. So what might be contributing to these data? So let's start off with prescription meds. And for those who are familiar with the channel, this won't be a surprise. I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism in my early 20s, so I've been taking levothyroxine for about half my life. For this test, it was 137.5 micrograms per day. Note that this story will be a bit different for the blood test number 3 in 2025 video, as I was recently able to reduce my levothyroxine dose and increase, include cytomel, which is T3. What that does to biomarkers, we'll find out in just a few days as I'm blood testing for the third time in 2025. All right, so next up are supplements, and there were only 2 for this test. The first is vitamin D. So I took 2,000 IU's per day for all 42 of the 42 days that correspond to this blood test. So what does that mean? What is the 42-day period? Well, it started immediately after blood test number 1, which was on February 4th, and it lasted through the day before blood test number 2 on March 17th. So that's 42 days in between blood tests. And note that I currently live in Boston, so for mostly the non-summer months, 8 to 9 months out of the year, I've been supplementing with vitamin D, but that story will change too, as after June, I'm moving to Austin, Texas, so I'm planning on getting full body sun exposure for the majority of the year as opposed to a minority of the year. All right, so then the next supplement is nicotinic acid, and I've been doing that to raise NAD because mine has a propensity to be on the lower side. My range without NAD precursors is in the 20 to 30 micromolar range with an average around 25 micromolar. Now, I found that very low dose nicotinic acid increases my NAD. For this test, for 7 days before testing NAD, I supplemented with 102 milligrams of nicotinic acid per day. Now, note that I'm not taking a 42-day average, which I do for most all other biomarkers, and that's because NAD is a metabolite whose levels change relatively quickly in response to dietary change or supplementation. So a 7-day average is pretty good in terms of being correlated with NAD changes over a very short period of time. Now, rather than just assuming that nicotinic acid will increase my NAD above baseline, I've been measuring. So on the same day as this test, on March 18th, I sent blood to Ginfinity for NAD analysis. And if you want to measure your own NAD levels, there's a discount link in the video's description. So for this test, NAD levels were 43 micromolar in response to 100 milligrams per day, about 100 milligrams per day of nicotinic acid. Now, that's not as high as my highest NAD levels in the 60s, 67 micromolar, but that leads to terrible flushing at a much higher nicotinic acid dose, 600 milligrams per day. So for now, I'm going to stick with 100 milligrams of nicotinic acid per day. And in an upcoming video, there may be something else, another dietary nutrient that can impact NAD. So stay tuned for that story coming up in an upcoming video. All right, so that's it for supplements. No geoprotectors or senolytics, purported senolytics, at least for now. Which then brings us to diet. What diet composition corresponds to test number 2 in 2025? And that's what we'll see here. This is the full list. This is the average daily dietary intake for that 42-day period that corresponds to test number 2 in 2025. And note that I weigh all of my food and then I log it into Chronometer. So these data for the list in terms of how much food of foods that are on the list is as close to accurate as one can get as I'm using a food scale. So the list is ranked in grams with 2 exceptions. Green tea, which is in ounces, which is a staple. I'm drinking that every day. And if you want to use what I use, there's a discount link in the video's description. And then the second on this list that is not ranked in terms of grams is cookies and cookie dough. So that's 52 calories per day, not grams. And I didn't eat 52 calories of cookies every day. That's 1 day of cookies over a 42-day average. And I'll have more on that story in the cheat meals section of the video. All right, so then for every test, I do experiments by changing things in the diet or potentially even adding supplements, not for this test, but for the next test, there'll be a couple of supplements added in addition to the 2 that I just mentioned. But I'm always trying to optimize weak spots without blowing up the overall approach. As we can see, my biomarker data, most of it is relatively youthful. So what experiments did I do for this test? So the first is trying to reduce Candida IgG, which has been higher than the reference range for 9 consecutive tests. And I do have some symptoms of that. Well, a couple of my toes look like they've got a fungal infection. I've got something going on my eyelid, some eczema that could be related to Candida. I'm not sure. So I reduced foods that contain the fiber arabinoxylan. Now, growth of Candida grows on glucose, but it can also grow on fiber, which is arabinoxylan. So to test that hypothesis, I reduced arabinoxylan containing foods, which in my diet come from flax seeds and corn. So for this test, average daily flaxseed intake was 3 grams per day, whereas it was 13 grams per day for test number 1. And for corn, I reduced it by about half, from 76 to about 38 grams per day. But remember, this is a 42-day average. For 29 days before the test, I completely cut these foods out. So zero intake of flax seeds and corn for 29 days before testing. Now, note that Candida can also grow on sugar. So to test that, I increased fat intake and reduced net carbs. And where I increased my fat from was whole food, not seed oils or anything else, and from almost exclusively from walnuts. So for test number 1, average walnut intake was 10 grams per day, and I increased that to 45 grams per day. And I should mention that higher fat, in my case, didn't have major negative impact on the biomarkers, so I'm planning on sticking where total fat was for upcoming biomarker tests. Now, whether that will help me enable to optimize weak spots, we'll find out, but the overall structure for this test is pretty good, so I'm planning on sticking with this going forward. All right, so I also reduced beet intake, and the rationale behind that is including beets for their nitrates, which can help with blood pressure and vasodilation, is that overkill when considering my abundant collard green intake, which also contain nitrates. So we can see that I averaged for this test more than 300 grams of collard greens, so I'm getting a good dose of daily nitrates. So is also getting nitrates from beets. For test number 1, it was 265 grams per day. Is that overkill? So to test that, I reduced beets from, again, as I said, 265 grams per day to 11 grams per day. And I should mention I haven't noticed any negative impacts on blood pressure, which I'm now measuring every day, first thing as soon as I wake up in the morning. Now beets, and I'm pro beets, don't get me wrong. Beets also contain a significant amount of sucrose and fructose and oxalate. So to test the hypothesis if reducing beets could be good for my biomarkers, even though they have a strong net positive correlative score with biomarkers, I dramatically reduced them and the majority of biomarkers didn't get worse. So I'm going to keep them relatively low for now. I'm open to including them back in for later tests to see if they may improve certain weak spots if they develop. All right, so I also made 2 smaller changes. One is I cut onion intake from 14 to 4 grams per day. And the primary rationale there is only because it gives me pretty bad gas. Onions do contain inulin, which is a prebiotic, which is purportedly good for the gut microbiome. And I say purportedly because in very high doses, it can negatively impact liver function. That's probably not what's happening in my case. No impact on liver function at very low doses, but bad gas. So to balance that equation, I doubled kimchi intake, and kimchi has probiotics. Whether that can make a positive impact on gut health is debatable. I don't yet have my IOLO metabolomic results to look at gut bacteria-specific metabolites to see if these changes move the needle in the right direction. All right, so that brings us back to the cookies and cookie dough story. So when it comes to cheat meals, and I mentioned this in a video with Chris Loomis, so if you missed that, I'll link the specific portion of that video in the right corner. So in terms of cheat meals, I can't go completely cold turkey. In the past, that's led to a binge, and I'm trying to avoid any binges as that's the antithesis of sticking to a calorie-restricted and potentially pro-longevity approach. Now, prior to about 4 years ago, I had a problem with eating junk on, say, Fridays and Saturdays, eating almost nothing for a few days after that, and then repeating the cycle, sort of a binge-purge cycle without actually purging, but, by fasting after eating a lot of junk. So I've been able to avoid that for about 4 years until this test. So on the first day, and again, I mentioned this full story in detail, again, with Chris and Loomis, it's the video in the right corner. So immediately after blood testing, I had my pretty standard junk, which is peanut butter mixed with chocolate, homemade Reese's peanut butter cups, and with some grape jam. It was delicious. On day 2, I started off with some pre-made cookies that I made the day before with extra chocolate chips. And note that even though I do include cheat meals after the blood test, I try to stay eucaloric. So I'm not trying to go from 23 or 2,400 or 2,200 calories to something much larger. It's not a complete cheat day, but it's cheat meals. So I had some cookies and cookie dough on the list while sticking to my eucaloric or my relatively low calorie intake. And that after I ate those cookies, I couldn't stop. So That led to a 5,700 calorie day. I cracked. I ate more peanut butter, more chocolate, more grape jelly. So it ended up being 5,700 calories per day. Fortunately, after the last test, that didn't happen. And I'm trying to minimize that occurrence. Hopefully, I can now start a new 4-year streak, at least, where this doesn't happen again. As it wasn't fun to eat. Granted, 5,700 calories is fun, but then cutting calories over 3 or 4 days after that is not fun. All right, so in terms of junk calories, cookie dough was almost 2,200, chocolate chips about 900, the grape jam or jelly about 600. So about 3,700 calories came from junk. And when dividing that by the total amount of calories consumed for this test, that was 4% junk of all calories. So the diet was 96% clean for this test. Now, that's one way to look at it. The other way is that I had basically a 40-day washout before testing. So whether it's I didn't reach that threshold of going over junk calories to negatively impact the biomarkers 40 days away, I'm not sure. But usually the junk calories are less than 1%, at most 1 to 2% of total calories. All right, so this list is ranked in grams. What about top contributors coming from calories? And that's what we'll see here. This is the top 10 foods for average daily calorie intake for that 42-day period that went from test 1 to test number 2. And note that this list is generated with Chronometer. If you want to track your own diet using Chronometer, discount link in the video's description. So atop the list for the first time, bumping out sardines, which had been atop the list for many, many tests, are walnuts. And note that I'm not trying to blow up the system here. So, we can see that 8 of the top 10 foods that are on this list were also the same for test number 1. And if you missed the test number 1 diet composition video, I linked to it in the right corner. So walnuts made the top 10, and so did salmon, wild-caught salmon. And what left the top 10 were beets and yogurt. All right, so what about macronutrient composition? So we've gone through foods. What about macros and even microbes? Micros, not microbes. So average daily calorie intake was 2167 per day, and this is relatively high, as this is my highest calorie intake over the past 8 tests, where I had a low of 2076 calories per day. So I've been slowly increasing calories, and we'll see why I haven't gone lower, and that story involves body weight. So body weight declines after 50 to 60 years in both men and women, and I'm going to use the plot using BMI, which is essentially a body weight story. Even though BMI is weight in kilograms divided by height in meters squared, and height, there is a small decrease in height over time, the changes in body weight are far larger. So BMI plotted on the y-axis against age on the x. And we can see that BMI and correspondingly body weight peaks in midlife and then declines for the remainder of life. So about half of the lifespan, BMI and correspondingly body weight declines. So the goal is to be weight stable. And a major factor underlying the age-related decline for body weight may be cancer cachexia or undiagnosed cancer, which can contribute to basically atrophy of fat and muscle for the remainder of the lifespan after midlife. Now, I've also been tracking body weight in addition to everything else since 2018. And we can see that here from August 2018 through March of 2025. And note that each dot corresponds to the average monthly body weight, as it's easier to visualize by looking at around 30-day averages rather than, all of the days for that about 2,100-day period. So starting in about January of 2021, we can see that I've been able to consistently reduce body weight over time, and that's almost exclusively from calorie restriction. But the first thing to think is, am I just on that downward trend for body weight over time, as shown in the image below? So in the image below, this is unintentional weight loss, and this is important to an important distinction to make, because unintentional weight loss, and somewhat quickly, can be indicative again of undiagnosed cancer or cancer cachexia. Now, in my case, this isn't unintentional weight loss. This is intentional weight loss, as I've been slowly reducing calorie intake over that about 4-year period. Now, I mentioned that the goal is to be weight stable. So for about 6 or 7 tests, that was true, but then body weight started to increase. And then after that relatively small peak in late 2024, we can see that it's been decreasing. So I'm trying to stay weight stable. That's why I'm not currently at 2076, my lowest calorie intake over this span, why it's currently at, or it was for this test, 2167. That's why it's at 2167. and why I haven't kept it relatively low. Now, for the next test, to try to stay weight stable, I've actually increased it by a bit more to 2200, around 2200, as I'm trying to stay around 140 and not get leaner, as below 140, I've noticed, starts to mess with in-workout performance, and I'm not trying to lose any muscle or any strength or any functional ability because I'm just too light and too lean. All right, so next up for macronutrients is protein intake, which average protein intake for this test was 101 grams per day, which is about 19% of total calories. Next up is fat intake. So we can see that for this test, average daily fat intake was 106 grams per day, and that's 44% of total calories. And for perspective, for test number 1, it was in my usual range, which I've been sticking to based on correlations with around 25 to 30 biomarkers of 89 grams per day. However, as I mentioned earlier, 106 grams per day for total fat isn't the highest fat level that I've had since 2015, since I started tracking both diet and biomarkers, because going way too high for fat may start to move biomarkers in the wrong direction, including glucose, paradoxically. But 106, as I mentioned, 106 grams per day seems to be a good number to hit based on the full spectrum of biomarkers, at least for now. In terms of where the majority of that fat came from, it came from omega-6. And again, that's almost exclusively from walnuts. Now, there's a bit of this omega-6 phobia all over the interwebs. And we can see that for test number 1, my average was about 16 grams per day, which is where it's been for many, many tests, as going higher in my data may be bad for biomarkers based on their correlation. So I stayed around 16 grams per day. So we can see that I close to doubled my omega-6 intake, again, from walnuts, whole food. This isn't from seed oils or anything else. I close to doubled omega-6 intake, and that didn't have any negative impact on biomarkers. So I think we can put, at least based on my data, I can put some of that omega-6 phobia to rest, at least up to about 29 grams per day. Would that be even worse if I went higher? I don't know. I'm not going to do the experiment to find out. For now, at most 29 grams per day of omega-6 coming almost exclusively from nuts and seeds is where I plan to stay. In terms of other fats, monounsaturated, omega-3, and saturated, that too is shown here. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Next up is carb intake. This is the carb intake that corresponds to test number 2. So total carbs are 242 grams per day, but note that net carbs equals total carbs minus fiber. Average daily fiber intake was 68 grams per day. So when subtracting that from total carbs, we get a net carbs of 174 grams per day. When multiplied by 4 calories per gram, that equals 32% net carbs that correspond to test number 2. Now note that fiber also contributes calories, as a fraction of total fiber, about 20%, is fermented by gut bacteria into short-chain fatty acids. So for this test, about 111 calories can be added to total fat, or 5% of total calories coming from fiber can be added to total fat, as they're converted, again, soluble fiber being converted into short-chain fatty acids. Now note that for the previous test, test number 1, the contribution from fiber was 7.2%. So I reduced fiber too. It wasn't just a small fat increase, but it was also a small fiber cut. And this has been generally good, again, for the biomarkers, but also, it may be TMI, but I've been battling an internal hemorrhoid for about half my life. And that dramatically improved with the shift to going a bit higher fat. So I'm planning on continuing, again, higher fat going forward. So now we can see net macros for this test were 49% fat, 32% net carbs, and about 19% protein. Now, within carbs, I also track sugars, but more specifically, fructose intake, as the diet contains a lot of fructose-containing fruits and vegetables. So total fructose for this test was 53 grams per day. That's by adding fructose divided by sucrose divided by 2, as sucrose is half fructose. 53 grams per day may seem like a lot, but that's far from my highest, which is 122 grams per day since I started tracking in 2015. So 53 may seem like a lot, but that's on the lower side of my fructose intake range since 2015. All right, next up are micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. And the vitamins may be hard to see, so I'd encourage going full screen if you haven't already. As I mentioned in many times in these videos in this series for diet composition, for those who are interested in trying to optimize biomarkers, one of the first steps is always to try to get full RDA coverage. So covering the RDA for all vitamins and minerals. Now, how high one should go or not above the RDA in terms of optimizing biomarkers, that comes by looking at correlations. And that's the approach that I've used since 2015 to get me to this 22-year younger biological age. Note that all of my tests are not 22 years younger. It was in that ballpark for test number 1. And this has been a rare event, but I've been able to get better over time. And I think one reason is because I follow correlations with biomarkers, which I post on Patreon. So if you're interested in that, check it out. Now, one example of those correlations that I've been following is vitamin K. And you can see that it's about 25 times higher than what's been considered as an adequate intake, which is about 90 micrograms for men. And the only reason that I've gone that high for vitamin K is by following its correlations with a panel of 25 to 30 standard biomarkers that include liver, kidney, immune cells, metabolic health, and so on. If you've ever wondered what's optimal for biomarkers, then I have a new Patreon tier dedicated just to that. These aren't the reference ranges. This is biomarker data, 29 biomarkers, 45 published references, currently more than 2 hours of content that focus on how each of these biomarkers change during aging and their associations with all-cause mortality risk to derive optimal ranges that may be important for health and potentially longevity. So if you're interested in that, check it out. And if you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon, where besides looking at monthly averages or 42-day averages for diet data, I post daily diet data on Patreon, in addition to many other things in other tiers. And before you go, we've got a whole bunch of discount and affiliate links that you can use to test yourself that help support the channel, including ultralabtest.com, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests, the clearly filtered water filter, I use that every day, at-home metabolomics, testing that at every test, in addition to the standard blood chemistry markers, oral microbiome composition, I'm still working on fixing that, NAD testing with Infinity, epigenetic testing, at-home blood testing with Cyfox Health, which includes the DNA methylation test GrimAge, which I'll have more about in an upcoming video, green tea, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, so if you're interested in wearing the ConquerAging or Diet Trying brand, as I've got on here, that link and all the other links will be in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.